Back in the Middle Ages, warfare wasn't just about who was braver or stronger. It was also about who showed up with the right tools. And some weapons felt unfair for a simple reason. They let regular soldiers threaten people who were supposed to be untouchable, like heavily armored knights and fortified castles. A few smart designs could wipe out years of training, ignore social rank, and change what commanders could even risk on a battlefield. In this video, we're looking at the medieval weapons that forced everyone to adapt, from machines that made walls feel less permanent, to ranged weapons that made open ground dangerous, to infantry tools that could stop a charge cold. These aren't fantasy superweapons. They're real innovations that reshaped medieval fighting step by step, and once they spread, warfare never really went back to the old rules. Number 1. The crossbow. The crossbow broke one of the quiet rules of medieval fighting. You didn't need a lifetime of physical training to throw serious power downrange. With a regular bow, especially strong warbows, your body is the machine. With a crossbow, the machine does a lot of the work. You lock the bow onto a stock, pull the string back with a belt hook, a lever, a windlass, or a crank device called a craniquin, and the trigger holds all that tension until you fire. That means a soldier can aim longer without shaking, and it means commanders can create effective shooters without waiting a generation for their muscles to develop. A lot of crossbows used a rotating nut and a simple trigger to hold the string. That sounds basic, but it's a big deal in practice. It gives a consistent release, which helps accuracy. It also lets you keep the weapon cocked while you wait, something that's much harder with a powerful hand bow. On a wall walk or behind cover, that ready-to-fire state turns into real control over a piece of ground. That's why people at the time sometimes called it unfair. It felt like it short-circuited the social order, where mounted knights were supposed to dominate open battle. Writers complained, and church leaders even tried to restrict its use between Christians. Those bans didn't erase the crossbow, but they show how disruptive it seemed in a world that liked to dress war up with ideas about honor and proper combat. In practice, crossbows changed two things at once: who could deliver lethal force, and how ranged troops were used. A crossbow's punch came from high draw weight packed into a short, stiff bow called a prod, made from composite materials in earlier versions and later from steel. The bolts were shorter and heavier than arrows, so they carried energy in a compact hit. Against mail and padded armor, that could be decisive. Against good plate, outcomes depended on distance, angle, and bolt design, but the bigger shift was psychological. Knights could no longer assume that distance was safe space. Because crossbows reload slowly, they encouraged a shoot, shelter, shoot rhythm. That's where you see pavises, large shields set up like portable cover, especially with professional units such as the famous Genoese crossbowmen. City militias liked crossbows too, because the weapon fit garrison life. You can train watchmen, defend gates, and fight in cramped streets where a long bow is awkward. In sieges, crossbows were perfect. You could keep one cocked on a battlement and wait for a target to show itself. In field battles, they worked best when commanders treated them as controlled volley weapons rather than fast-firing ones. Once armies accepted that hardware could replace years of training, it opened the door to something even more disruptive. A simple wooden bow that demanded a lot from the archer, but paid commanders back with speed, volume, and battlefield control. Number 2, the longbow. The longbow's unfair reputation isn't really about a single super shot. It's about scale. When you have large numbers of practiced archers, the longbow turns distance into a constant threat. A war longbow is tall, plain-looking, and physically demanding. Many examples likely drew well over 100 pounds, which is why governments that relied on archery pushed regular practice over years, not weeks. So yes, it took training, but it trained the kind of people a king could recruit in bulk. Free men who could be organized, paid, and moved from campaign to campaign. Rate of fire is the key. Crossbows can hit hard, but they're slow. A longbow line could keep arrows moving at a pace that made maneuver risky. That matters because medieval battles were rarely clean duels. They were about pressure, timing, and the way formations behave under stress. Massed archery doesn't need perfect accuracy to be effective. It punishes dense targets, breaks up charges, and forces the enemy to advance under constant disruption. Arrow design helped too. Broadheads were good against unarmored men and horses. Narrow, armor-focused points, often called bodkins, were meant to concentrate force on a smaller area. Plate armor at the best angles could defeat many hits, and archery wasn't a guaranteed solution. But war isn't about guarantees. It's about making the opponent's plan unreliable. Even when arrows didn't punch through, they could wound less protected areas, damage equipment, or simply force people to lower visors, lose spacing, and step out of formation to help a teammate. Longbow tactics also pushed armies toward combined arms. English commanders often protected archers with stakes, ditches, or terrain, basically saying, if you rush this line, you're doing it the hard way. When the enemy did commit, the arrow storm created confusion that dismounted men-at-arms could exploit. That logic shows up in the big battles people associate with the 100 Years' War, where armies learned that disciplined missile fire plus controlled positioning could neutralize expensive cavalry. There's a social angle here. Chivalry loved close combat, where reputation and rank could shine. Archery didn't care who you were. From the archer's side, it wasn't dishonorable. It was practical. If you need to stop a charge, you use what works. And once commanders accepted that infantry and missile troops could set the terms, they also needed close-range weapons built for dealing with armor and horses without relying on sword duels. Number 3. Polearms. Swords get the spotlight, but polearms did a lot of the real work. By the late Middle Ages, many of the most effective hand weapons were long shafts with specialized heads, because reach and leverage beat elegance. A sword is versatile, but against well-made armor, it often becomes a weapon of opportunity, useful for finding gaps, not for smashing through protection. A polearm lets you hit harder, control distance, and fight as part of a line. The pike is the purest example. It's basically a spear stretched into a very long, dense point fence. In tight formation, pikes deny cavalry the one thing it needs: room to close and use momentum. Horses won't happily drive into a wall of points, and even if the front ranks are shoved, the ranks behind keep those points coming. This is where the fight stops looking like a contest of individual skill and starts looking like geometry. A coordinated pike block can make a noble cavalry charge feel like running into a locked door. More versatile polearms, halberds, bills, and similar designs added hooks and blades. The hook matters because mounted warfare depends on staying mounted. If you can snag a shield, pull at a rider, or drag someone off balance, you change the whole fight fast. These weapons also had the leverage to strike with concentrated force, aiming at weaker areas like limbs, joints, or helmet edges. It's not about theatrics, it's basic physics. A long haft turns your body into a bigger lever, so a trained infantryman can generate impacts that matter even against armor. Battlefield history backs this up. Urban militias in places like Flanders, and later Swiss infantry, showed again and again that disciplined foot troops with long weapons could beat cavalry that expected to dominate. Knights adapted by fighting dismounted more often, and once they're on foot, the long weapon game becomes even more important. Then there's the poleaxe, which is basically a purpose-built anti-armor tool used by elites in armored combat. Many poleaxes combined a hammer face, a top spike, and a short blade. Manuals from late medieval fighting traditions treat it as a technical weapon, with grips, footwork, and specific ways to exploit openings. Knights were still dangerous, but now the toolbox for fighting them was wider, cheaper, and more standardized. Polearms didn't just change duels, they changed command decisions. If infantry can hold ground, resist cavalry, and finish fights up close, leaders stop betting everything on mounted shock. Battles become more about maintaining formations, supporting units, and choosing terrain. And a lot of medieval war wasn't even about open battle. It was about taking towns, castles, and crossings. That's where the next unfair leap shows up, because it attacked the symbol of medieval security, the wall. Number 4, the trebuchet. The counterweight trebuchet turned siege warfare into a problem of engineering and patience. Earlier engines relied mainly on muscle power, with teams pulling ropes to swing an arm. A counterweight trebuchet uses gravity. A heavy weight drops, The long arm whips around, and a sling releases a projectile at the right moment. The counterweight might be a big box filled with stones or lead, or a solid block, and changing that weight lets engineers tune the machine. Once the crew has the timing down, it can repeat the motion with impressive consistency. The unfair part is that it made bravery on a battlement less important than timber, rope, math, and the ability to keep working under pressure. A trebuchet could smash masonry, chip towers, and strip away the protective features defenders relied on. Even when walls didn't collapse quickly, steady bombardment forced defenders to repair, rotate exhausted men, and accept that the attackers could keep applying force from outside arrow range. Trebuchets also show how medieval armies were already thinking like artillery forces. They needed carpenters, rope makers, engineers, scouts to find materials, and guards to protect the build site. Defenders responded with sorties to burn machines, counterfire with smaller engines, and constant repair work. The weapon wasn't just the machine, it was the whole siege system around it. Projectiles weren't only stone. Attackers could throw fire-based payloads to start blazes inside a town or force people away from key positions. Again, the goal of most sieges was surrender. If defenders felt the walls weren't safe and supplies were vulnerable, they were more likely to negotiate. The trebuchet pushed sieges in that direction by turning walls from permanent protection into something that could be reduced with enough time and resources. Trebuchets had limits. They were big, slow to move, and vulnerable while being built. But they trained commanders to think in terms of bombardment and structural destruction. Once gunpowder artillery matured, it offered the same promise: break walls from a distance, with increasing efficiency. That transition didn't happen overnight, but it changed the logic of medieval power in a way no sword ever could. Number 5. Gunpowder weapons. Early European firearms were awkward, but they introduced a new kind of force. The first hand cannons were basically metal tubes, sometimes mounted on a stick or a simple rest. They were slow to load, produced a lot of smoke, and weren't great for precision. Even so, they mattered, because explosive propulsion scales in a way muscle power doesn't. If you can improve powder quality, casting, and drill, you can keep raising performance without asking soldiers to become stronger humans. That's why gunpowder felt unfair in the long run. Like the crossbow, it changed the training problem. You still needed skill, but the key skills were process skills. Loading steps, keeping powder dry, handling a match cord, firing by command, and holding formation during reloads. Those are teachable through repetition. As armies professionalized, firearms fit neatly into that world, and they made battlefield power less tied to aristocratic upbringing. In open battle, early gunners needed protection because reloads were slow and cavalry was still dangerous. That pushed armies toward mixed formations, where different troops covered each other. Polearms to block charges, missile troops to disrupt, and men-at-arms to stabilize the line. Over time, as handheld guns improved and lead balls became more common, armorers responded by thickening breastplates and helmets, while commanders relied more on drill and coordinated volleys than on individual marksmanship. The biggest shock, though, was siege warfare. Cannons and bombards could deliver repeated, concentrated impacts into the same section of wall, especially at closer ranges, where accuracy mattered more than flight arc. As casting improved, bronze guns were often prized for reliability. Artillery became a standard tool for forcing breaches. Fortifications responded with thicker, lower walls, angled surfaces, and expanded earthworks, because stone alone wasn't enough against sustained cannon fire. That arms race didn't just change castles, it changed budgets and politics, because only states and big cities could consistently pay for the best guns and gunners. Bows, crossbows, and polearms didn't vanish right away, but once gunpowder became good enough, it kept improving. That creates a one-way street where organization and production start to matter as much as courage. And one of the clearest late medieval examples of that new mindset is surprisingly simple: turning wagons and teamwork into a mobile fortress. Number 6. War wagons. War wagons, often associated with the Hussite Wars in 15th century Bohemia, show how medieval armies could weaponize organization. The basic idea was to lock sturdy wagons into a line or box, sometimes chaining them together, then use them as cover for infantry. Inside and between the wagons, you could place crossbowmen, handgunners, and small artillery, with polearm troops ready to defend gaps or surge out at the right moment. This feels unfair because it lets an army create strong defensive terrain almost anywhere. If you don't have a hill or a wall, you build one. Wagon lines blunt the shock of cavalry by giving horses something they can't easily push through, and they buy time for slow-loading missile troops to do their job. That makes the battlefield less about sudden charges and more about controlled phases: absorb, disrupt, and then counterattack when the attacker is disorganized. The important detail is that the wagon isn't the whole weapon. The weapon is the system: cover plus missile fire plus disciplined infantry plus timing. A handgun by itself is clumsy. A handgun fired from cover, supported by polearms with clear commands, becomes a reliable tool. That's the direction European warfare was already moving in during the late Middle Ages. More planning, more drill, and more emphasis on denying the enemy their favorite advantages. You still see knights, swords, and heavy armor in this world, but they're increasingly part of a larger mix. A mounted elite fighter can be brave and skilled and still end up forced to fight on foot, under missile fire, against a wall of points with artillery in the background. Once wagon forts and coordinated volleys become standard options, commanders can slow the battle down, control lanes of movement, and make the opponent spend strength just to reach striking distance.